Once upon a time, in the quiet village of Mbale, nestled between lush green hills and tall trees, there lived a young girl named Zubaida. She was a kind-hearted child with a bright smile, but life had been cruel to her. After her parents passed away in a tragic accident, she was sent to live with her uncle, Abasi, and his wife, Nima. Zubaida had hoped her relatives would love her like her parents did, but that hope was crushed quickly. Nima saw her as nothing more than a servant. Every morning, long before the sun rose, Zubaida was forced to fetch water, sweep the compound, and cook breakfast. Her cousins, Bakery and Malaika, lounged in the shade, laughing and playing, while Zubaida worked endlessly. Nima's voice often thundered across the house. "Zubaida, why are you so slow? Do you think this is your father's house?" Zubaida was afraid of Nima's sharp tongue and even sharper hand. The few moments of rest she had were spent in a small, cold storeroom that Nima called her room. At night, Zubaida cried softly, hugging the thin blanket she used as comfort. Her uncle, Abasi, knew how she was treated but never intervened. He was a quiet man who preferred to avoid conflict, even when he saw the bruises on Zubaida's arms. One day, Nima sent Zubaida to the market to sell bananas. "Don't come back until you've sold everything," she warned, waving a cooking spoon at her. Zubaida nodded and set off, her tiny frame struggling under the weight of the basket balanced on her head. The market was bustling with people shouting prices and haggling over goods. Zubaida stood quietly in a corner, hoping someone would buy her bananas quickly. But hours passed, and her stomach growled from hunger. She had not eaten since the night before, as Nima often withheld food when she was angry. The sun was scorching, and Zubaida's legs felt weak. She tried to steady herself, but the world around her began to spin. She staggered forward, the basket slipping from her head and scattering the bananas across the dusty ground. People turned to look as she fell to her knees, then collapsed onto the road. For a moment, everything was still. Then the murmurs began. "Who is she?" someone asked. "Looks like she's starving," another whispered. A few people moved closer, but no one stepped forward to help. Zubaida lay there, her face pale and body trembling, as the crowd grew around her. Just when it seemed like no one would intervene, a car pulled up and stopped abruptly. A tall woman with a calm, commanding presence stepped out. She wore a vibrant kitenge dress and had a soft, caring face. "What's happening here?" she asked, her voice firm yet gentle. "She just collapsed," a man replied, shrugging. The woman bent down and touched Zubaida's forehead. "This child needs help," she said, lifting her carefully. "Out of the way, please." The crowd parted as the woman carried Zubaida to her car. The woman, who introduced herself as Mema Rabina, drove straight to the nearest hospital. Zubaida was rushed into the emergency room, where doctors and nurses worked quickly to stabilize her. Mema Abina waited anxiously outside the room, praying silently for the little girl. When the doctor finally came out, his expression was grave. "She's malnourished and severely dehydrated," he said. "And these scars, this child has been through a lot." Mema Abina felt her heart ache. "Who could do this to her?" she asked softly. The doctor shook his head, unsure of the answer. When Zubaida regained consciousness, she was startled to find herself in a clean, white hospital bed. She looked around nervously until her eyes met Mema Abina's kind gaze. "It's okay, my dear," Mema Abina said gently. "You're safe now." Tears welled up in Zubaida's eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone cared. Zubaida woke up to the soft sound of birds chirping outside her hospital window. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The bed was soft, the room smelled clean, and the air was cool. She blinked, unsure if this was real, until she saw the warm smile of the woman sitting beside her. "How are you feeling, my dear?" Mema Abina asked gently. Zubaida hesitated, then nodded. Her voice was faint, but she managed to say, "I'm better." "Good," Mema Abina replied, brushing Zubaida's hair away from her face. "You've been through so much, but you're safe now. My name is Mema Abina, and I'll be here for you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Zubaida felt a flicker of hope. But the memories of her past haunted her, and she found it hard to believe she was truly safe. The doctor entered the room shortly after. He smiled kindly at Zubaida but spoke to Mama Abina in a more serious tone. She'll recover physically, but she's clearly been neglected and mistreated for a long time. We need to report this to the authorities. Mama Abina nodded. Of course. Whatever it takes to make sure this never happens to her again. Zubaida's heart raced at the mention of authorities. She was afraid of what her uncle and aunt might do if they found out she had spoken about them. Sensing her fear, Mama Abina took her hand. Don't worry, Zubaida. No one will hurt you again. I promise. After a few days in the hospital, Zubaida was discharged. Mama Abina brought her home to her family, a modest but welcoming house filled with love and warmth. Pastor Juma, Mama Abina's husband, was a kind man with a deep, calming voice. He greeted Zubaida with open arms. You're part of our family now, he said. Zubaida couldn't believe her ears. She had her own bed, her own clothes, and more food than she could eat. It felt like a dream. But even in this safe haven, she struggled to let go of her past. She flinched at loud noises, hesitated to speak, and often woke up from nightmares. Mama Abina and Pastor Juma were patient. They encouraged her to talk about her feelings and reassured her every step of the way. Slowly, Zubaida began to trust them. She even started school, where she discovered a love for reading and writing. But life wasn't without challenges. One day, while Zubaida was walking home from school, she saw a familiar figure standing by the roadside. Her heart sank. It was her cousin, Bakery. He smirked when he saw her and walked up to her. Zubaida, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Auntie Nima says you need to come home. You don't belong with those people. Zubaida froze, her mind racing. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. What's the matter? Scared? Bakery taunted, stepping closer. Before Zubaida could respond, a voice called out. Is everything okay here? It was Pastor Juma. He had come to pick her up from school, as he often did. Bakery's smirk disappeared, and he quickly walked away. Pastor Juma placed a reassuring hand on Zubaida's shoulder. Don't worry, Zubaida, he said. We'll make sure you're safe. That evening, Mama Abina and Pastor Juma decided to involve the police. They reported Bakery's actions and explained Zubaida's situation in detail. The police began an investigation, gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. As the truth about Zubaida's life with her uncle and aunt came to light, the villagers were shocked. Many had suspected Nima was harsh, but no one knew the extent of her cruelty. Slowly, people began to speak out, sharing stories of how they had seen Zubaida working tirelessly or heard Nima shouting at her. The police eventually arrested Abasi and Nima. It was a terrifying moment for Zubaida, but Mama Abina stood by her side, holding her hand tightly. You're brave, Zubaida, she said. And no matter what happens, we're here for you. For the first time, Zubaida felt a sense of justice. The people who had hurt her were finally being held accountable. It was a long road ahead, but she was no longer walking it alone. The day of the trial was one Zubaida would never forget. The courtroom was packed with villagers who had come to witness justice being served. Zubaida sat beside Mama Abina and Pastor Juma, her small hands trembling as the proceedings began. The prosecutor presented the evidence, photographs of Zubaida's scars, testimonies from neighbors, and the doctor's report detailing the years of abuse and neglect. Witness after witness took the stand, each recounting moments when they had seen or heard Zubaida suffering. When it was Zubaida's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. The memories were painful, and the thought of facing her uncle and aunt filled her with fear. But then she felt Mama Abina's hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than you know, she whispered. Zubaida took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was soft but steady as she recounted the years of mistreatment, the hunger, the beatings, and the endless days of work. Tears streamed down her face as she described the night she fainted on the road, believing it would be her last moment. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet. Even the judge seemed moved by her bravery. Nima and Abasi, who had denied all the allegations, looked down in shame as the evidence became undeniable. The judge delivered the verdict. Both Nima and Abasi were found guilty of child abuse and neglect. They were sentenced to years in prison, with a strict order to stay away from Zubaida once they were released. As the gavel struck, Zubaida felt a wave of relief. For the first time, she was free from their shadow. She turned to Mama Rabina and hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. The weeks that followed were a time of healing. Zubaida threw herself into her studies, determined to make the most of her new life. She excelled in school, quickly catching up with her classmates. Her teachers often praised her for her intelligence and resilience. But Zubaida's journey wasn't just about academics. She began to open up to those around her, forming friendships and sharing her story. She joined a local group of children who met weekly to share their dreams and ideas. Zubaida discovered a passion for writing, often penning short stories about courage and hope. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Pastor Juma brought up a special topic. "Zubaida," he began, his deep voice filled with warmth, "Mama Rabina and I have been talking. We want you to know that you're not just staying with us. You're part of our family now, forever. We'd like to adopt you, officially." Zubaida's eyes widened. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The adoption process took several months, but when it was finalized, Zubaida officially became Zubaida Abina Juma. She felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. Years passed, and Zubaida grew into a confident, compassionate young woman. She never forgot her past, but instead used it as a source of strength. She pursued her dream of becoming a doctor, inspired by the kindness of those who had saved her life. On the day of her graduation, Zubaida stood on stage, looking out at the crowd. She spotted Mama Rabina and Pastor Juma in the front row, clapping proudly. In her speech, she said, "There was a time when I thought the world had forgotten me. But one act of kindness changed everything. If we all choose kindness, we can change lives, just as mine was changed." The audience erupted in applause, and Zubaida felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew her journey was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came her way.
Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories.